Can you go home again on the internet? Can you go back to the before times, to the times of MySpace and web rings, AOL Instant Messenger, and forum posts, to static web pages that you found on Yahoo that just happened to be somebody's hobby, to a simpler time where the web felt full of possibilities but also somehow familiar and knowable. We've talked in the past few episodes about what happens if your online community disappears and moves, and what happens if you try to rebuild it but there's still embedded problems, but we haven't really addressed the question of can you go back again, and why might you want to? Over the past few months, there's been an increasing call for the return to the simpler days of the internet, return to a dial-up pastorale, and we're going to look at that in this episode of the Implausipod.
Welcome to the Implausipod, an academic podcast about the intersection of art, technology, and popular culture. I'm your host, Dr. Implausible.
And in this episode, we're going to weave together some disparate threads, all calling in their own way for a return to a simpler internet. This is an expanded audio version of our newsletter that we originally published back in May of 2024, building on the themes that we discussed there. So if you have already read that, then thank you for joining us, and stick around. We're going to explore it in a little bit more depth. And if you haven't checked out our monthly newsletter yet, then by all means, go check the link in the show notes and subscribe if you'd like. But let us return to the topic at hand. What exactly is the Dial-up Pastorale? What is going on? Back in March of 2024, I started noticing a common theme in a number of articles that were being published. And while I'm not sure if this is just a coincidence, a trend, or perhaps just a case of the Baader-Meinhof effect, where if someone mentions something like a VW Beetle, you start to see them everywhere, or the frequency illusion, it seems that there's something more floating around in the zeitgeist. And in this case, it's a wistful return to that idyllic age of the internet, whether it was real or imagined. Back last year when we were talking about how various internet platforms function as the public sphere, as reading Jürgen Habermas's Further Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which is an article he published in 2022, where people were looking at these digital platforms and seeing how the theory had changed in the internet age. And having that floating around the background is probably what primed the pump or enhanced my senses up to just below Spidey levels in order to get a sense of what was going on, and that seems as good a starting point as any. Jürgen Habermas is a German philosopher who, at the age of 95 in 2024, is still somewhat active, as noted by this paper we're looking at that was published in 2022. It's titled Reflections and Hypothesis on a Further Structural Transformation of the Political Public Sphere, and it was published as part of a special issue of Theory, Culture, and Society in that year. Here they had invited a number of authors to talk about how the internet had changed the public sphere in the 21st century, how the traditional public sphere was morphing and reacting to those changes, and some speculation about what might be coming next. And Habermas, as the public sphere guy, provided a conclusion and overarching summary. Now, his work on the public sphere isn't perhaps his best-known work. That would rather be the theory of communicative action. He is one of the top 10 cited academics in the social sciences and humanities, up there with like Goffman and Marx and Weber. But the theory of the public sphere is still incredibly relevant to our understanding of the communication systems and infrastructure that we have in our society, and especially with the changes that have come around because of the internet. Habermas originally published The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere in 1962 in German, even though it took a few more years before there's a translation in English and it became more widely known. And in the article, he's providing commentary on the changes that have happened in the last 60 years since its initial publication. And because of this, his work feels both timely and dated at the same time. The disruption that has taken place in media since 2008, to pick a date at random, quote-unquote, warrants this re-examination, but the historical nature of Habermas's work is looking at traditional mass media, what we think of as newspapers, magazines, radio, and even TV, and that feels really, really dated in 2022 or 2024. In 2024, are mass media even still a thing? I mean, maybe yes, if we're looking at something like the Olympics, but the relevance of mass media is slipping away. And Habermas recognizes the changes somewhat, noting that the reach of new media, TV, and radio have held ground, and newspapers and magazines have cratered as the unrelenting wave of, quote, digitalization is transforming the structure of media. The online platforms and digital gardens are rising and in ascendancy, and this is, quote, taking place in the shadow of a commercial exploitation of the currently almost unregulated internet communication, end quote. The challenge, then, is whether the instability that we currently experience can be addressed, or if we'll return to an earlier pre-Renaissance way of forming public opinion. And we can see some of this in the work of other authors, like that of Varoufakis, who talks about the rise of Technofeudalism, but more on that in a future episode. With respect to Habermas' statement, I think he's largely correct that the digitalization and digitization of everything has really changed media, even though I might contest whether TV and radio have held ground. I feel they've really dropped off. But his experience in the current media landscape of the EU might be radically different than mine. Our mediated experiences are not necessarily exactly the same, and that's really what we're talking about, because the structural transformation of the public sphere was a historical account of the coevolution of privacy and publicity in a mediated world. Habermas went back to the Renaissance area as he traced the origins of public opinion and how it was formed and shaped. And that was what was in the original book. It was by its nature a political work, and this continues here in his new article. He notes that there are some improbable conditions that must be fulfilled if a crisis-prone capitalist democracy is to remain stable, end quote. And this is the situation that we are very much living in, and we haven't quite reckoned with this with respect to our social media platforms, especially with all the elections that are taking place worldwide in 2024. We're seeing how our online discourse is being shaped by misinformation and disinformation campaigns, and the rise of generative AI tools that are being used to facilitate this. If you're swimming in the fast-flowing stream of social media, it may seem almost hopeless, that there's too much of it happening, it's coming at you too fast. But in Habermas's paper here, there is an element of hope, as the creator-generated aspect of modern social media allows for new voices to rise through. As Habermas notes, quote, the platform character of the new media creates a space of communication alongside the editorial public sphere in which readers, listeners, and viewers can spontaneously assume the role of authors, end quote. This is where the audience commodity fights back against their commodification. And this is what's so powerful about platforms like TikTok and Snapchat and YouTube, as well as other creative-driven practices like blogging and podcasting. But these are also further sources of tension. They expose, quote, the structural conflict between the public and private roles of citizens. And this is where something like TikTok is a great leveler, as it makes those private sphere moments public, as we discussed last episode. But on the same hand, those platforms can also highlight the incoming inequality that we experience, as the increasing media literacy of the users has shown the disconnect between the lives of influencers and the rest of us. In May of 2024, this manifested as an almost all-out revolt against the influencers with the creation of the hashtag Digitine, which started as a response to a video by New York influencer Haley Bailey saying, "Let them eat cake" in a Marie Antoinette-inspired dress at the Met Gala. This completely tone-deaf presentation, when average families are struggling with the increased inflation in basic food prices and rent, led to the internet users deciding to cut off the influencers from the source of their power, their followers, their massive audiences that they command, and started a mass blocking campaign. This saw Bailey losing 10 million followers, Kim Kardashian losing 9 million, Taylor Swift reportedly losing 3 million within the first weekend of the campaign. Now, since May, I'm sure they've bounced back a little bit, but the fact that the internet does recognize that the influencers are beholden to their audiences does give me some small hope. maybe, just maybe, the message is getting through. And regardless of the outcome, there's a very retrograde feel to it, something that ties in with our Dial-up Pastorale, which is all about looking back to earlier eras. And this brings us to our next stop, a call to rewild the internet. Originally published on the online magazine Noma in April of 2024, Maria Farrell and Robin Bergen's article, We Need to Rewild the Internet, looks at the internet through an ecological lens, and they suggest that a specific call to action is needed, one that can combat the affront of the entrenched, bemoted, and increasingly walled gardens of what Yuval Varoufakis calls the cloudalists, the Technofeudalists and their fiefdoms, the Zuckerbergs and Musks of the world. So they start with a historical look at failures in ecology, in particular as case of German forestry in the 19th century, how a particular model of a monoculture in forestry led to a systemic collapse and a completely devastation of the industry. What the authors note is that in writing on the internet, whether it's academic or not, there's a fundamentally flawed assumption, and that is that the internet is an ecosystem, and that metaphor is pervasive throughout all analysis. The reason it's flawed is because they state that online spaces are plantations, and they make a strong case, and this jives with a lot of what we've talked about on this podcast before as well, with respect to the commodification of audiences. They look at the commodification that occurs online, initially of the audiences, and now of the very content that they create, which is then tossed into the hopper of the digital shredders, providing fuel for the generative AI tools that sell our soylent culture back to us for a monthly fee. However, all this machinery is starting to heat things up. In order to combat this climate change for the internet, the authors argue that it is necessary to rewild it, to rebuild resilience by restoring autonomous natural processes and letting them operate at scale to generate complexity. End quote. For Farrell and Bergen, the challenge that they see is that the internet as it stands is pretty close to a monoculture, with choices limited to one or two vendors in most areas when it comes to ICTs. The infrastructure is, quote, locked in, and the values that are embedded in that infrastructure are designed for extraction and control. They quote Leanne Starr's work on infrastructure from 1999 and note how built environments can have values embedded within it, and that specific choices need to be made when deciding what to use. Now, for the authors, the tools that can rewild the internet already exist, and those are the tools of the simpler internet, the RSS feeds, the blogs, newsletters, email lists, podcasts, and other simpler forms of association. They specifically mention the Fediverse, which we've talked about at length in other episodes, especially episode 10, as an option that exists outside the current social media spaces, and they also note that a rewild internet won't look like it's out of the 1990s, as if it was made out of AOL, Lynx, and Gopher, and they all came back to dominance. But that's a bit of a shame, because the internet did feel a lot more knowable back in the 90s, and that's unlikely to ever happen again. Still, there is a shift taking place, and that shift is seen in the next of our articles as well, The Revenge of the Homepage, which was originally published by Kyle Chayka on The New Yorker in May of 2024. In it, Chayka looks at the recent successes of various websites that decided to function as a place, places like Verge and Semaphore, which both made a conscious decision to angle away from algorithmically optimized content to avoid the BuzzFeedification of everything. And the author traces this shift back to the dissolution of Twitter as the commonplace of the internet, the internet public sphere, as we mentioned earlier, and the dispersal of everything back out to, well, everywhere. The article is still largely focused on the corporate web, sites like the New York Times and Verge and Semaphore, and it continues the maddening trend that characterizes social media in a way that just means Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and excludes the TikToks and Snapchats and social media companies that are actually challenging the arguments that the author is making when it comes to community formation. But overall, there is a thread here that gets it right, that there is a return to websites as places one goes to directly and not hitting the filters and aggregators of social media indirectly. Whether that works for everyone or not, I can't say, but it's interesting that the Dial-up Pastorale has found its way even to the pages of the New Yorker. Is there an urban desire for the bucolic countryside? Well, perhaps, and perhaps that's always been part of what made the Pastorale the Pastorale. But perhaps nothing sums up that Pastorale, that desire to go back to the internet of our youth, than Molly White's article, We Can Have a Different Web, from her newsletter Citation Needed in May of 2024. Within the article, she presents an ahistorical take on the history of the internet, focused on the good old days, a period of personal web pages, fewer trolls and bots, and an earlier aesthetic and ethic of what the World Wide Web could be. She states that none of this is gone, which is largely true, even though it's now a fraction of it once was, made even smaller as it is dwarfed by social media giants that now dominate the landscape. But the ahistorical nature of this piece is that the tiny window where this imagined space of the internet might have existed is such a tiny sliver that I don't even know if it ever actually took place. The non-commercial web was always present. There was always only a sliver of time when it's on its own. CompuServe was offering limited internet access by 1989. AOL launched their DOS version in 1991. The corporate-backed Prodigy system allowed web hosting and access to the web in 1994. And these big three accounted for most of the users of the internet who weren't using university accounts or, small providers. So the walled gardens that White refers to were always there. It's just that different walls were put up in the 2000s that encompassed social media companies that we now think of. And this is perhaps the greatest strength and biggest failing with the piece. It's an aspirational piece. It refers to an imaginary web that we think we remember, but one that historically never happened. It alludes to the social imaginary of a slower, more pedestrian internet, but it leaves out that it was already corporate by the mid-1990s. We may have just forgotten the extent to how corporate it was back in the time. So, what is the Dial-up Pastorale? Well, it's the sum of all these takes, not just the articles themselves, but also the online discussion that takes place. People that react to those articles and say, yes, this speaks to me as well, that confirm this, even if they're things that never really took place. And this speaks to what's happening, right? That there is an underlying thread that connects these various return movements in the real world. As a researcher of the internet and online culture, among other things, and one of the things I like to say back when I taught classes on new media was there's generally nothing different between online and offline spaces, aside from the velocity that comes from the annihilation of distance. And if we take that as a truth, then there should be similar patterns seen in various return movements that are seen in the real-world examples that we see online. Does this mean that there's a conservative tendency inherent within these return movements online, even though most people involved likely not identify as conservative and would scoff at the suggestion? Well, perhaps. Not all of these return movements are on the level of Guédelon Castle in France, the experimental archaeology project trying to rebuild a castle using traditional methods. But I think there's a connection to the ethos of the movement, a closeness to the previous lived experience where it is knowable and the processes of daily life are more available at hand. The digital pastorale is a retreat from the liquidity and flow characterized by the algorithms and a desire to plant one's feet on solid ground. Of course, the pastorale is also a musical movement, whereas pastoral is the longing for an idyllic kind of life, of simpler times and shepherding and gardening and bringing together so many ways. We adopt pastorale here as the collection of these voices, independently crying out for a return to that simpler era of the internet. The pastorale is an assemblage of pastoral voices, brought together to raise a symphony that calls out to those yearning for that long-ago time. A call that is faint, yet just loud enough to be heard by those attuned to the wavelength. That wavelength, that of the Dial-up Pastorale, that of websites and personal homepages seems idyllic, though I think they neglect the next element needed, that of finding one's way, of search, or absent search, as Google goes downhill and AI search can't be trusted, a map, a path through the pasture, a directory. Perhaps not quite the network of pre-Google homepages we had, the AOLs and GeoCities and Yahoos, but maybe this. But something closer to DMOZ, a shared set of links and known good websites built on trust and personal recommendation and curation. This has happened before. How did it work and why did it go away? We'll look at this in a future episode of the Implausipod.
Once again, thank you for joining us on the Implausipod. I'm your host, Dr. Implausible. You can reach me at drimplausible at implausipod.com, and you can also find the show archives and transcripts of all our previous shows at implausipod.com as well. I'm responsible for all elements of the show, including research, writing, mixing, mastering, and music, and the show is licensed under a Creative Commons 4.0 share-alike license. You may have also noted that there was no advertising during the program, and there's no cost associated with the show, but it does grow from word of mouth of the community, so if you enjoy the show, please share it with a friend or two, and pass it along.
In addition, we've started a newsletter on the blog. Feel free to check out the link in the show notes and sign up to that. Please join us soon for our next episode. Until then, take care and have fun.